Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. 4 years ago, the New York State Senate leadership redrew Eric Schneiderman's district lines in an attempt to defeat his reelection. Fortunately for all of us, he was elected by an overwhelming majority and represents the 31st Senate District, which includes Washington Heights, Inwood, and Riverdale. Unfortunately, it doesn't still include parts of the West Side, so you no longer represent me.
Sorry.
It's too bad. I'm sorry. You're now the deputy leader of the Democrats, the deputy minority leader of the state Senate.
Right.
Which means you're leading the Democrats. How many Democrats are there in the state Senate?
27.
Out of 50.
Out of 62.
Out of 62. If it was 50, we would have the majority.
Yes.
We'd be good. We're always looking to achieve great Democratic victories, and you, in fact, ran the campaigns to help other Democrats get elected in the Senate, hoping that would really make a difference in the running of the government, right? Why is the state legislature, let's just spend a sentence on it to explain to viewers why the state legislature is so important.
Well, most of the power in our country is vested in the states. And, this is something in New York City where many people feel that the center of the universe is the city. People sometimes lose sight of this. The state government controls all of the funding. I mean, the federal funding flows through the state budget is enormous. So issues that are important to New Yorkers, like school funding, the school funding formula that's been the subject of litigation for more than a decade, that's all Albany. Domestic relations law, issues like gay marriage, all Albany. Anything to do with civil rights, with labor law, workers' compensation, pensions, it all has to pass through Albany. So it's really
criminal justice.
It's really
prison system.
all the criminal justice laws, the effort to reform the Rockefeller drug laws, the fight over the death penalty. This is all what's controlled in the state legislature. And because New York has what's called a strong leader system, where the power, it's really like Congress was 60, 80 years ago before the reforms. The leaders of the majority party in each house have pretty much absolute power over what goes on there. So the Republicans in the state Senate,
excuse me,
even though this is an overwhelmingly Democratic state, and a fairly progressive state, are able to block pro-choice bills, civil rights bills, reforms to the criminal justice laws. They are adamantly opposed, while the Assembly is very supportive of the effort to reform the school funding formula so that it doesn't discriminate against schools in New York City. That's, our view is that it's time for a change in leadership in the Senate. And since 2003, when David Paterson became the Senate Democratic leader and I became the deputy leader, we've had a very successful effort, I think, to challenge the Republicans on fundamental issues. We won 3 seats from them in 2004, and we're looking to continue to build towards a majority in 2006. But it's really based on these fundamental philosophical differences. This is not.
What state is there? There is a state that doesn't have a strong leadership legislator. Strong leader, like what? How are they organized?
Well, there are
then?
States that have nonpartisan legislatures. There's states that have all different systems.
Or one legislature.
In some states, the governor is very powerful. Some states, the governor is not that powerful. I mean, one of the knocks on George Bush as governor of Texas is that, in fact, the position of governor of Texas is not comparable to the governor of New York. But New York has the Senate Republican leadership has an absolute veto power. We're all excited about electing a Democratic governor. I think Eliot Spitzer will, barring some bizarre circumstances, will be our next governor. But the Senate leadership has the power of confirmation over all judges, commissioners that he wants to appoint.
Right. Not the Assembly. It's like the Senate and the House.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then also, of course, you have to enact a law, you have to pass it in both houses. So it's going to be a challenge. But I think the sense that the current leaders of the Senate are really out of touch with most New Yorkers, I think, is growing. And the sense that our conference, David Paterson's done a lot to restore credibility, I think, to our conference. He's now been selected to run for lieutenant governor.
Well, so that's going to lead a vacancy in the leadership in the Senate, but that's another question.
Yes.
Do you think we're going to have a majority? Do we stand a chance of electing a majority of Democrats to the Senate this year?
It's possible. It's unlikely. I mean, gubernatorial years are always tough for down-ballot races. There are a lot of Democrats who, in spite of our best efforts, only come out in presidential elections. But if we can hold on to the gains we've made and try and pick up a seat or two.
And then count on the larger
we
vote.
would be in a great position in 2008.
Eric, but why is it so dysfunctional? And you raised an interesting point when you said that New York City people think New York City is the whole place. So do we pay less respect and attention to state legislators than they do outside of New York City?
Absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating to me traveling around the state and working on campaigns around the state. Voters in Syracuse, in Rochester, in Buffalo are much better informed about what their legislators are doing, and to a great extent what's going on in Albany. In New York City, again, this is a frustration of many of us who are trying to change the state and make it back into the progressive model for the nation that it was 100 years ago. In New York City, people are tremendously supportive of national campaigns. Right. We raise more money for national Democrats than far and away than any place else in the country, and yet neglect our own backyard. I mean, if you were running for the U.S. Senate in Montana, you could have an easier time having a high roller fundraiser in Manhattan than you could if you're running for the state Senate in Utica.
They feel close to the mayor, not necessarily to city council. I mean, I don't think they understand in large parts of the city what the city council does, but the city council is really very secondary to the powers of the state.
Well, I think they have substantial power over local government, but the big picture issues usually require some approval or some involvement from Albany. But I think that what's happening now is I think Democrats are growing up a little bit, and one of the reasons we are is because the conservatives, who started out really building from the absolute grassroots up, working in state legislators, working in local governments, have taken over the country with a political movement that has deep roots. Democrats tend to obsess about who's going to be our nominee for president and expect that person to carry all the water. Well, it doesn't work. It hasn't worked. We have a conservative movement that I think is doing tremendous harm to the country, and that most people disagree with, and yet we haven't taken the time to build from the bottom up.
So we're talking about the party, the Democratic Party.
I think
that we haven't got a set of principles that we stand for that makes it really important for people to vote for Democrats.
Well, I think there are principles. I think it's really more of getting an orientation towards politics as a movement rather than politics as a bunch of individual candidates with their own
That's what's
fiefdoms.
happened. What's happened since we reformed the system with the conventions and television. It's really what's happened when you don't need a political party to reach voters. Don't you think part of it is that?
Part of it is that. But I think that that was sort of something that contributed to the dismantling of the old organization. But what we've seen in the meantime is that on the right they've built a new form of organization with people mobilized through churches, through other social action networks. They have publications, they have think tanks. The Republican Party, as in its present incarnation, dominated by the conservatives, would be recognized as a political party in most of the rest of the world. It's a party of the right. They have their own ideology, they have their own institutions that transcend individual candidacies, which is the key to their success.
And we don't.
The Democrats, we tend to be more obsessed about individual candidates. So having a movement, and this has been actually great, very enjoyable to be a part of building this sort of statewide movement to take over the state Senate. It's something that doesn't have to do with me or David Patterson or any particular individual. The goal is to change politics in Albany for decades to come if we can make this transformation.
So do you have a better definition of the Democratic Party outside of New York City?
Well, I think the lines are pretty clearly drawn I think in most parts of the country. I think not so much because the Democrats have built a movement, but because the Republicans have moved so far to the right that I think that the Democratic alternative is pretty clear.
But they tend to be a coalition of different organizations that seem to be committed to certain issues. I mean, a lot of things have changed, and I know it more than you because I'm older, but the party used to reflect a lot of different issues and views. We don't. We fight it within our party on different issues.
Well, but I don't think that's necessarily
the party
unhealthy.
Platforms, just nationally, the party platforms used to be very important. Nowadays, you don't hear anything about a party platform, really.
I'm not sure how important they were. I guess
I spent nights fighting, and before conventions on the platforms of the parties. I mean, you can't believe what would go on.
And then did those platforms actually get enacted into policy if we won, or in those days we were always losing? So
yeah, we were always losing, right? So I mean, yes, they were. McGovern ran on those platform issues, and he lost overwhelmingly, right?
I remember.
So
acid amnesty and
no, come on. But I mean, the party doesn't. There is, if you have the need to raise so much money, and you have the use of television, which you don't have locally, so that makes a big difference. And I think you're right. It does allow you to define a party better locally.
No, I don't. No? See, I don't think the media is the problem. I mean, again, it's not. You don't have to look any further than the conservative movement. I mean, you got to give credit where credit is due. They started when a lot of their ideas were tremendously unpopular back in the 1970s, and built a movement, developed some core principles. Government is the problem, not the solution. Cutting taxes creates jobs. Hierarchical, patriarchal structure is the best way to organize society. And they hammered away relentlessly on these core principles, elected people who believed in them, provided support over a sustained period, not just to electing people, but to changing the public's ideas over time. And that's the difference between a political party based that's really in movement politics and a party like what we've had as the Democrats. And I do think we're growing up and it's changing now, but the Democrats have been for a while a party that really has been more about individual candidates and politicians.
Are you talking about nationally or locally?
Nationally. And locally, but I think the era of the Democratic Party succeeding where everyone has their own pack and everyone is just watching out for themselves, I think is over.
I hope so. I hope you're right. But I mean, we just had a meeting of the moderate Democratic, what's it called, the Democratic
Leadership Council?
Leadership Council. Al Frome is talking again about how the center is where we should all go. And there is an agreement on that.
No, I don't think there's agreement, but I think that there's an understanding that we have to stand for something other than individual candidates. Even if I disagree with some of the things that they say at the DLC, they're talking about an ideology. They're fighting over what the ideology should be, and they have a view of the Democratic Party as a long-term movement. They want to set up institutions that can sustain us. To advance ideas, sometimes you have to get people to be willing to run and lose to promote ideas.
Absolutely, and nobody's willing to do that.
You can't do that if you don't have something that exists before and after.
So where do we have that in New York?
Well, I think that
you do think in the Senate.
I think that in the Senate conference we've achieved that to a certain extent since Patterson became the leader, because we've created our own movement. Yeah. We're helped by a lot of progressives, and there are people who are coming to us now, people in the Assembly and the Council who might otherwise not have been as interested, because they see that we're trying to do something different. We're running on a reform platform, and it is attracting some attention. And Albany is a place where the desire for reform is tremendous, and yet the resistance to reform is even more tremendous. So it's something that has enabled us to fill a gap that a lot of people are looking to see filled.
Is it dysfunctional only because of the power of the leaders? It's not really, is it?
Well, no, I think part of it's
an endless.
It is puzzle. It is a structure. No, it's a structural problem, and I think that there are reforms that you can enact that would open the process up. I think that the difficulty in Albany is that it's such an entrenched machine of money and politics and the relationship of the sort of the lobbying culture to the leadership of the legislature. Everyone who's there is pretty comfortable with the status quo. Most of the people who are there, not me, but a lot of people who are there are, and I think that you have to break that up. You have to create an atmosphere where people are more excited about and receptive to change. The key to that, I think, is having a governor who, as I think Eliot Spitzer will be, who really is committed to change. I mean, he is ambitious for his role as governor in the best sense of the word. He doesn't just want to get elected and then sustain himself. He really wants to make New York a model, to show what can be done, to show that the public sector can deliver. I mean, we have problems in New York State that have gone on for decades. The problem of the collapse of the economy in central and western New York is a disgrace.
And it's been there forever.
And the people are sick of hearing
the
folks in Albany saying, "Oh, well, we got this program, we got that program, we're going to do this, we're going to do that," and they just watch things get worse and worse and worse. So, I think that Eliot is committed to working on that, to actually, and not just with rhetoric, but to doing something about it.
But it's interesting because I saw a notice in the paper, and I looked it up before you came on the program. This was done a couple of years ago, but it reflects what the influence is, and it reflects the way politics goes, is that there's a biotech center being built in Senator Bruno's district.
Right. Well, Senator Bruno's district is turned out to be the right location for a lot of projects, both government and private sector. But that's one of a relatively minor aspect of the strong leader system.
Let's just explain. When that happens, though, who does that? Is that the governor's decision, or does the Senate do the Senate and Assembly vote on that allocation?
Yes, it's enacted into law like any other bill. It has to pass the Assembly and the Senate, and it's part of a deal. I mean,
because then there are things in there for the
problem. Right. This is why taking over the Senate, our conference taking over the Senate, will transform politics. Will transform in the Assembly too. The Assembly won't have to agree to pass a bad law in order to pass a good law, and it changes the whole dynamic. I think there are things that my colleagues in the Assembly would love to get done, but the cost on the other side is tremendous.
Let's talk about, I mean, you're known as the leader, I think, basically of progressive, one of the leaders. Maybe I'm I'm being overly generous.
I'm one of quite a few
progressive leaders. What are the major issues, do you think, in the state that you want to see accomplished if you're ever able to take over the Senate?
I think that the basic issues that we have to address pretty quickly, and I know Elliot talks about everything changes on day one. Well, everything will change on day one, but it'll take us, it could take us a year or two to get some of this done. The big barrier still being the Senate. If we were able to, I think New York State has a responsibility to fill the gap created by the federal government. And I think that areas that unfortunately that used to be thought of as federal responsibility, the states have to deal with now. I mean, if you look at something as basic as the stem cell research decision,
the big issue, right.
is that's something where the federal government has abandoned the field. We have fundamental issues that are the province of state government that we've allowed to collapse really around us over the last couple of decades. The first thing we have to deal with are the basic functions of government. Everyone should have a good public school in their community. This is something that is absolutely achievable. It's not like developing a cure for cancer. We know how to run good public schools in this country. That's something we have to do. That makes us a stronger state for the long term. That enables us to compete, and it's a matter of fundamental American justice. Every kid should not be limited in their opportunity in life because they grow up in a poor neighborhood. We have to reform our healthcare system, which is far and away the most expensive in the country, and yet we have one of the largest pools of uninsured people. I sponsor a bill that Senator Gottfried sponsors in the Assembly for a New York State single-payer health plan. It would cost less than what we spend now. It would enable us to use all of our leverage and purchasing power to reduce costs. And that's the kind of thing that I think people in New York State...
Massachusetts, is that the only state that's done something?
No, there are a few states that have this, and obviously in Vermont they have universal health care for all the children in the state, and it may be that the first step is to cover children. Public safety, again, every community should have, every kid should be able to walk down the street safely, and it shouldn't depend on how rich your parents are. These are basic functions of state government.
So where does the money come from?
We've got, believe me, in the New York State budget, I don't think we have to raise taxes. I'd like to reorganize the way we collect taxes in order to fund these things. I think the money is there. We get rid of these wasteful economic development programs. We let some nonviolent offenders out of jail and bring down the prison population, a huge cost saver. And keep in mind that reforms to things like good education and health care for all, there's a tremendous savings that you realize pretty quickly. So I think the people in New York State are willing to invest, and I think people would even be willing to go along with some temporary tax increases if it meant that they knew where the money was going. I think that given the size of the state budget right now, I think we can afford to do pretty much everything we have to do without any significant tax increase. I'd like to see the tax burden redistributed, because right now we're too dependent on the property tax. The income tax for the top rates has come down, and that's created gaps that the conservatives in the Republican Party, they don't cut the size of government.
No,
they just shift the burden to
right.
poor people, things like sales tax and property tax that don't necessarily tax the people with the greatest ability to pay.
There are all kinds of programs that are being talked about as far as supportive programs in communities. I mean, you talked about prisons and sending people home. one of the great problems in the prison population is recidivism, and one of the proposals is that there be more community support. And it seems to me in a lot of those issues, that's what comes across. Is anybody talking about that up in Albany?
Sure. Oh, sure. I mean, I think that, we went through this era where in spite of the incredible cost, we went on an incarceration spree in New York State, and
now but some communities are so dependent on that.
I mean, I think, and there are a lot of interesting aspects to it. Another issue that I'm very involved in fighting about has to do with the redistricting, redoing the way we draw districts, and Assemblyman Adriano Espaillat and I have a bill that would change the way they count prisoners, which could have a tremendous and profound effect on both the correction system, but also on politics in New York State.
They count prisoners in the prison, don't they?
They count prisoners for census purposes as being residents of the prison. So if they take people out of the communities, primarily downstate, poor
move
communities,
them up.
they move them into these rural areas, and there are, I think, 7 state Senate districts upstate that would not have large enough population to meet the minimum requirement for a Senate district if they didn't count the prisoners. So, and it costs the communities the prisoners come from, because if there are any programs that are based on a per capita formula, they don't get as much funding. So it's really a disgraceful situation. Now, we don't have to count prisoners that way. We can count them, at their last known address, and that's something that's the kind of reform that is not really high up on people's radar screen, but with a Democratic Senate we can enact. It's tremendously important to the inner city poor communities where a lot of these prisoners come from, and important for equalizing the Senate districts to the good of all.
Did we really reform the Rockefeller laws enough this year?
No, well, we didn't do anything this year. I mean, we had 2 years of incremental reforms, but we still have a ways to go. I mean, I think we have to follow through again on a principle that has to go beyond one legislative session or one campaign, which is that we should make every effort possible to use treatment when it can be used, to keep nonviolent criminals out of prison. There's really, drug gangs are a big problem, and some of the prosecutors have objected to this, but someone who is a nonviolent criminal, maybe a mule who might have had possession of a large quantity of drugs but really wasn't a decision maker in the enterprise, putting that person in a high, maximum security or medium security prison for a long period of time doesn't do us any good. So the principle is, let's use the least intrusive method. Let's use the least burdensome method for the state that can help bring someone back in. Most of these people, virtually everyone, comes back sooner or later. And I assure you, they don't stay in those communities where they're counted for census purposes. When people talk about me in politics, they say, Ronnie's interested in city politics. Do they say you're interested in state politics? And is there another group of people that's interested in national politics? How do we all get together? Well, I don't...
Because I'm not just interested in city politics.
I don't know anyone who thinks you're interested in city politics. I mean, you're interested in politics across the board.
But how do we take the spirit you're building, or, suppose that you are, but I hope you're, I take your word, you're building it for the state Senate. How do we take that and bring it on a broader scale? How do we bring back people's interest in politics and in the Democratic Party?
Well, I think it is happening. I think it's happening in different parts of the country. I do think that a lot of it will be state-based initially, because I think that the culture in Washington is difficult to change in Washington. And, everyone who goes there as a representative is elected in a state, elected in a district, and I think that as the politics changes in some of the states, I think that's going to have a profound national
we have a political problem
effect.
in this state. It's very interesting because we have 2 United States senators who really, neither one of them has really taken a strong stand or said, yes, I'm sorry I voted for this. I mean, I think both of them have voted for Iraq, and I don't even think Schumer has said, I'm sorry I voted for it. Clinton certainly hasn't. These are the 2 United States senators from one of the most states that's always been known as one of the most democratic states, right? It's a state where candidates don't even come to campaign. So we have a very interested electorate. We got a lot of people who are opposed to this war. We got 2 senators who aren't necessarily opposed to the war. One of them is running for president. What does that do to the Democratic Party organization in the state? I think it's made us all a little quiet.
You think?
I do.
I don't really think so. I think that you know, there is a big difference between state politics and national politics. I think that both of our U.S. senators are perceived as providing leadership on a, well, you got to look at the Senate, perceived as providing leadership on a host of other issues. I will tell you that, again, this is something that, you know, maybe doesn't get as much attention as it should, but Chuck Schumer has transformed the effort to take back the U.S. Senate. And, you know, there was a piece recently in the Times about his counterpart,
Right.
the head of the Republican Senate
Right.
Campaign Committee, and how poorly they're doing.
Right.
Well, that's really, they were doing
Right.
poorly in relative terms.
But they're doing poorly because they have a president also who's very unpopular right now.
No, I think,
that
doesn't stop them. I mean, there's a
Right.
natural propensity of a lot of business interests to give to the Republicans. I think Chuck is just kicking them, kicking them the way they should be kicked. So I think that people in New York State, I think Democratic voters, you know, they care about the war, they care about other issues also. I think that you know, you can look at a situation like the situation in Connecticut, where I think there's a much more profound sense of dissatisfaction with, you know, the incumbent's failure to stand up to the Republicans on a variety of issues. And that's not the feeling I think people have about, I mean, I don't think people feel that Hillary Clinton doesn't fight the Republicans hard enough. They feel that Hillary Clinton has been in this life for decades-long blood war with the Republicans and is willing to stand up.
We're at the end of this program, so give me one really good, optimistic, enthusiastic thing.
I think that people will look back on this decade as the decade that people on the left in the United States, progressives, finally learned the lessons that the conservatives have been teaching for years. We're trying to become more of a movement politics. We're trying to transcend individual candidacies. We will move forward.
What's your favorite
basis.
website?
My favorite website?
Yeah.
Schneiderman.org.
All right.
It's got all the links to the other stuff, too.
Thank you very much,
Thanks,
Eric,
Jenny.
and very good luck to you. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.